The rifle came up before Effie Garrison had even brought her wagon to a full stop, and she found herself staring down the black eye of a Winchester held steady in the hands of a man she had never seen before in her life. "That's far enough," he said. His voice was low and rough, like it had not been used in some time, and it carried clean across the frozen yard between the barn and the cabin. "Climb down slow and keep your hands where I can see them." The cold had already numbed most of the feeling in Effie's fingers. So slow was the only speed she had left in her. She set the brake, wrapped the reins twice around the post the way her father had taught her so many years ago, and climbed down from the wagon seat with the deliberate care of a woman who understood that a man holding a rifle at dusk in December, with the temperature already dropping toward zero, was not a man in a mood for sudden movements. "I am not armed," she said, and her breath came out of her in a long pale ribbon that the wind tore apart almost as soon as she spoke it. "I am a traveling librarian. My name is Effie Garrison, and I have books and letters for the Hollies family and for Widow Prout, and I would be grateful beyond telling if you would let me shelter my horse before the wind gets any worse." The man did not lower the rifle. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who did his own labor rather than hiring it out, and even in the failing light she could see the hard line of his jaw beneath a several days' growth of beard. He looked at her the way a man looks at a coiled rattlesnake sunning itself on a porch step, uncertain whether it was asleep or only waiting. "Garrison," he repeated. "That's a name I've heard lately." Man in Larkspur Crossing nailed up a notice not 4 days back. Woman answering that name, dark-haired, traveling alone with a wagon, wanted alongside her brother for robbery and murder. $500 for the both of you, dead or in irons. Effie felt the cold reach all the way down into her chest then, colder than any wind off the bighorns. "That notice is a lie," she said, and she made herself say it steady, though her heart was going like a rabbit's. "My brother never robbed anyone and he never murdered anyone, and I have committed no crime except trying to find him before the men who want him dead do." "That's a fine speech," the man said. "Most folks running from a hanging have one ready." "Then shoot me," Effie said, "or put that rifle down and let me prove different, because I am nearly out of coffee, nearly out of oats for my horse, and entirely out of patience for being threatened twice in 1 week. If you mean to kill me, be quick about it. The wind is picking up and I would rather not die slow of the cold while you make up your mind." For a long moment the only sound was the wind combing through the bare cottonwoods along the creek, and the small stamping shuffle of her horse, and somewhere behind the cabin a dog that had not yet worked up the courage to bark. Then, slowly, the rifle came down. "Got nerve," the man said. "I'll grant you that much." "It is the last thing I have left," Effie said, and she was surprised to hear her own voice crack on it just slightly, just enough that she pressed her lips together and looked away toward the darkening tree line rather than let this stranger see more than that. He studied her a moment longer, and something in his face shifted, some hardness giving just a little at the edges, though he did not smile. "Name's Raymond Ramsey," he said. "This is my land. I'd be obliged if you tell me the truth of that notice, because I don't hold with shooting women, wanted or not, but I don't hold with harboring murderers either, and until I know which one you are, I mean to keep my distance." "That," Effie said, "sounds like the first sensible thing anyone has said to me in a week." The wagon box behind her held 4 crates of books, a satchel of letters bound for 6 different homesteads scattered along Antelope Creek, and beneath the false bottom her father had built into the 3rd crate years before he died, a leather folder of papers that she had promised her brother she would guard with her life if it came to that. She did not mention the papers. Not yet. Not to a man who had just leveled a rifle at her heart on the strength of a piece of paper nailed to a post outside a trading post. But she told him the rest. She told him that her brother, Daniel Garrison, had kept the books for the Continental Land and Cattle Syndicate's office in Larkspur Crossing, and that he had found things in those books that a man was not meant to find. Records of homestead relinquishments signed by families who swore they had never signed anything, dates altered, witnesses invented out of whole cloth. She told him that when Daniel tried to send what he'd found to the land office inspector in Cheyenne, a surveyor named Whitcomb had turned up dead in a ditch outside of town, and within 2 days, there was a warrant out for Daniel Garrison's arrest for that very murder, and a $500 reward that had somehow, in the retelling, grown to include his sister as an accomplice. "I do not know where my brother is," she finished. "I have been riding my regular circuit and asking careful questions and hoping someone along the way has seen him, because I cannot walk into Larkspur Crossing and ask outright without a rope finding my neck for the trouble." Raymond Ramsey listened to all of it without interrupting, his arms crossed over his chest, the rifle now resting easy in the crook of his elbow rather than pointed at anything at all. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking not at her but out at the darkening line of the mountains. "I believe you," he said finally. "Just like that." "No," he said, "not just like that. I believe you because a woman running from a murder charge does not generally travel with 4 crates of primers and picture books, and a ledger of borrowers going back 3 years, which is what I can see through the gap in your wagon cover from here. And because Vance Cole came through my land 2 days past asking had I seen a dark-haired woman traveling alone, and I did not care for the way he asked it, like a man hunting something he meant to skin rather than arrest. The name meant nothing to Effie yet, though it would come to mean a great deal before the week was out. "Vance Cole, company man," Raymond said, "works for the syndicate doing the kind of work a company does not want its own name attached to. He offered me money to let him know if you or your brother came through. I told him I hadn't seen either of you, which was true at the time, and I told him I didn't want his money, which was also true. I do not care for that man, Miss Garrison, and I have learned to trust that particular dislike." He would not, however, let her stay the night in his cabin. He told her that plainly, without apology, and something in the way he said it, formal and a little stiff, told her it was not about her at all but about some rule he had made for himself, a long time before she had ever driven her wagon into his yard. "There is a line shack a half-mile east along the creek," he said. "Sound roof, a stove that draws well enough if you bank it right. You'll be safer there than out on the open road tonight, and safer than up at my house if it comes to that, on account of anyone still watching the roads, for you would not think to look at an old trapping shack nobody's used since autumn. And if Vance Cole comes back asking again, then I still haven't seen you," Raymond said, "because you won't be here. You'll be a half-mile east minding your own business, same as I intend to keep minding mine." It was not warmth, what he offered her. It was barely even courtesy. But it was shelter, and a stove, and the promise of a locked door between herself and the wind. And Effie Garrison had learned in the last hard week that a person too proud to accept plain practical help from a stranger did not last long in a Wyoming winter. She thanked him, and she meant it, and something about the plainness of her thanks seemed to unsettle him more than her story had. "Don't thank me," he said, turning back toward his cabin before she had even climbed onto the wagon seat. "I haven't done anything worth thanking a man for." He was wrong about that, though it would take him 2 more days to understand it. The line shack was cold enough when she reached it that her breath hung in the dark like smoke from a dying fire, but the stove drew just as he had promised, and by the time she had banked it and unrolled her bedding on the narrow cot, she was warmer than she had been in 3 nights of sleeping in the wagon bed with only a buffalo robe and her own doubled coat between herself and the frost. She slept harder than she meant to, and woke at first light to find, sitting just outside the door where her own footprints from the night before had already been half filled by blown snow, a burlap sack. Inside it she found a side of salt pork wrapped in oilcloth, a small sack of coffee, a tin of matches, 2 candles, and a folded wool blanket that smelled of cedar, as though it had been kept a long while in a chest and only recently taken out. There was no note. There did not need to be. She had heard no horse in the night, no footstep, nothing at all, and yet there in the snow leading away from the door were the tracks of a single man's boots, walking off toward the west, toward Raymond Ramsey's cabin, as plain as if he had signed his name. Effie stood in the doorway a long moment with the cold biting at her bare hands, looking at those tracks, and felt something in her chest that she did not have a ready name for. It was not quite gratitude, though it held gratitude in it. It was something closer to astonishment, that a man who had held a rifle on her not 12 hours before, a man who had told her plainly he intended to keep his distance, would nonetheless walk a half-mile through a frozen dark to leave salt pork and coffee at her door and walk away again without waking her to be thanked for it. She tore a page from the back of her ledger, the pages she kept for notes rather than borrowings, and wrote on it in pencil, "Thank you for the coffee, and the blanket, and for not shooting me." E.g. Asterisk, she weighted it under a stone on the doorstep where he would find it if he came again. And then she hitched her horse and continued on toward the Hollies' homestead, because whatever else was true, the Valley families were still waiting on their books and their letters, and a woman running from a lie could not afford to also stop living her life, or she would have nothing left to be innocent of when the truth finally came out. The Hollies' place lay 6 miles further along the creek, where the valley widened and the cottonwoods gave way to open meadow, frozen hard now and rimed white with frost that had not burned off even at midday. Ezra Hollies met her at the gate with his rifle slung over his shoulder rather than in his hands, which in the current climate of the valley Effie had begun to understand as something like a warm welcome. "Miss Garrison," he said, and there was real relief in his voice. "We had heard talk you might not be coming through this season on account of the notice." "I heard the same talk," Effie said, swinging down from the wagon. "I intend to prove it wrong." Mary Hollies came out onto the porch with 2 children trailing behind her skirts, and within the hour Effie had traded out 4 returned books for 4 new ones, delivered a letter from Mary's sister in Ohio that made the other woman cry outright at the kitchen table, and accepted in return a jar of preserved peaches and an offer to stay the night that she gently declined, on the grounds that lingering too long in one place was no longer safe for anyone who sheltered her. It was over coffee, with the children sent out to feed the chickens, that Ezra Hollies told her the thing that mattered most. "Company man came through here in September," he said, low, glancing once toward the door as though the walls themselves might carry word back to Larkspur Crossing. "Told us the syndicate held a lien against this claim on account of a loan my father took out before he died, a loan I never saw paper for and never signed for. Told us we could sign a relinquishment and take $50, or we could fight it in court in Cheyenne, which would cost us more than $50 just in the traveling and lose besides, because the company had judges in its pocket. We didn't sign, but the Prout place did, and I heard the Carmody place did too before they pulled up and left for Nebraska last month. Do you still have anything in writing? The lien, the letter, anything at all?" Ezra shook his head. "Man took it back with him when we wouldn't sign. Said he'd leave a copy at the land office in Larkspur Crossing for our records, but there's never been any copy there when I've asked." It was exactly the pattern Daniel had described to her in the one letter she'd received from him before he vanished, smuggled to her through a freight driver rather than the mail, which the company by then controlled through its influence over the postmaster. Forged liens, manufactured debts. Families frightened or bullied into relinquishing claims that had cost them years of labor and hope. Also, the syndicate could consolidate the valley's water rights before the railroad spur survey came through in the spring, at which point the same land would be worth 10 times what the company was paying to steal it now. "If I can get proof of this in front of the right people," Effie said carefully, "would you swear to it? In writing, signed?" Ezra Hollies looked at his wife, and some silent conversation passed between them that Effie had seen before in other kitchens, on other homesteads, the particular arithmetic of a family deciding how much risk they could afford to take on behalf of what was right. "I'll swear to it," he said finally. "This is our land, Miss Garrison. My father broke this ground with a mule and a plow he built himself." I'll not sign it away to a company sitting in New York that's never seen this valley and never will. And I'll not stay quiet while they steal it from a dead man's family through paper lies, either. It was the first sworn statement, but it would not be the last. And by the time Effie left the Hollies' homestead that afternoon, she understood with sudden, sharpening clarity that this was no longer only about clearing her brother's name. It was about the whole valley, and about whether the truth could travel faster than a company's money, which was, she thought grimly, tightening the harness against the cold, generally a very close race indeed. Raymond Ramsey told himself, riding into Larkspur crossing 2 days later for flour and horseshoe nails, that he was not thinking about the woman in the lined shack at all. He told himself this while he bought his flour, and while he bought his nails, and while he stood at the counter of Petra Yancey's trading post pretending to read the label on a tin of baking powder while he listened, with every ounce of attention he possessed, to the conversation happening between two men at the stove behind him. "Sorrel's fixed to move him Thursday," one voice said. This was Vance Cole. Raymond was nearly certain, though he did not turn to look. Out of the line shack up past Crazy Woman Creek and down to the county seat, where a friendly judge will see the thing settled quick and quiet. And the sister, this voice Raymond did not know, still loose. Doesn't signify much either way. Once her brother's dealt with, there's nobody left with sense enough to make trouble out of what he found. She's got no proof of her own, just a wagon load of storybooks. Raymond paid for his flour with hands that did not shake, though his blood had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside, and he walked out of Petra Yancey's trading post already turning the pieces over in his mind. Sorrel was Ike Sorrel, the deputy out of the county seat. A man everyone in the valley knew took his orders more from the syndicate's payroll than from any oath of office. If they meant to move Daniel Garrison on Thursday, dead or alive, then whatever evidence Daniel carried would either be delivered into the wrong hands or destroyed entirely. And either way, the truth of Whitcomb's murder would go into the ground with him. He rode home with his jaw set, and his mind working faster than it had in 2 years, and it was somewhere along that ride, with the wind picking up out of the northwest in the particular way that meant a hard freeze was coming down off the mountains, that he admitted to himself, plainly and without further pretense, that he was thinking about Effie Garrison after all, and had been since the moment she told him to shoot her rather than let her freeze slow. He had built his solitude carefully, these 2 years since Sarah died. He had told himself it was peace he had made for himself, out on this stretch of creek bottom with nothing but his cattle and his own silence for company, and for a long while he had believed it, because grief and peace can wear such similar faces from a distance. Sarah had died of a fever in a February cold snap not unlike this one, and Raymond had spent the 2 winters since guarding himself against ever again caring so much about another living soul that her loss could hollow him out the way Sarah's had. He had told himself that a man who wanted nothing could lose nothing. But a rifle leveled at a stranger's heart, and the plain nerve with which she had answered it, had cracked something open in him that 2 years of silence had never managed to seal. He found her lined shack empty when he rode past it that evening, the stove cold, her wagon tracks leading east toward the Prout place. And against every rule he had made for himself, he left another sack at the door anyway. This one with oats for her horse and a jar of Sarah's old preserved plums that he had been unable to bring himself to eat or to throw away for 2 winters running. And he told himself as he walked back toward his own cabin in the deepening cold that he was only doing what any decent man would do for a woman traveling alone in a hard season. He did not believe himself, not entirely, and that unsettled him more than the notice, more than Cole, more than anything Ike Sorrel might be planning for Thursday. Widow Agnes Prout's homestead sat in a hollow at the valley's narrowest point, where the creek ran fast and cold between banks close enough that a man could nearly leap across in summer. In December, with the surface skinned over in ice that had not yet frozen solid enough to trust. It looked less like a creek than like a long dark wound cut through the white land. Effie found the widow abed with a chest cough that rattled wet and deep, her breath short, her face gray in a way that frightened Effie the moment she saw it. "You ought to have sent for a doctor," she said, kneeling by the bed with the back of her hand against the older woman's forehead, which burned even through the cold of the room. "Nearest doctor's in the county seat," Agnes Prout wheezed, "and I haven't the horse to spare, nor the money for his time even if I did." Effie had, packed among her books, a small case of remedies her father had insisted she carry on her rounds. Learned from a physician's manual, she had read cover to cover more than once during long winter evenings. Mustard plasters for the chest, a tincture of horehound for the cough, willow bark tea for the fever. She set to work with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had done this before, on other homesteads, in other hard winters. And by the time the light began to fail outside the small window, Agnes Prout's breathing had eased enough that she slept without the terrible rattling catch in her chest. It was while she sat by the fire waiting for the widow to wake, mending a torn hem by lamplight, that Agnes told her, in fits and starts between sips of the willow bark tea, the story of the relinquishment she had signed in September. "They told me the loan against this place had come due," she said. "Told me my late husband had signed papers I never saw, borrowing against the claim before he died, and that the company would forgive the debt entire if I signed the land back over. I am an old woman alone, Miss Garrison. I had no way to fight it and no money to try. Did you keep anything, any paper at all?" Agnes reached with a shaking hand beneath her pillow and drew out a single folded sheet, creased soft with handling. "They gave me this receipt," she said. "Said it was proof I'd been paid fair. $50, it says, though I never saw more than 20 of it, the rest going to what they called filing fees." Effie unfolded the paper with careful fingers and felt her pulse quicken. At the bottom, beneath Agnes Prout's shaking signature, was a second signature she recognized instantly, having seen it 100 times on ledger pages in her brother's careful hand during the years he had kept books for their father before ever working for the syndicate at all. Witnessed, D. Garrison, notary. "Mrs. Prout," Effie said carefully, "did you ever meet the man who witnessed this? A young man, dark-haired, about my age." "Never laid eyes on him," Agnes said. "The company man who came, Mr. Cole, he brought the paper already signed that way, said their office notary had witnessed it beforehand." It was exactly as Daniel had written to her. His own signature forged onto documents he had never seen, manufacturing his complicity in the very fraud he had tried to expose, so that if he ever did come forward with the truth, the company could point to his own name on a dozen fraudulent relinquishments and call him the criminal rather than the witness. It was a lie built with terrible care, and it was working exactly as intended, right down to the wanted notice that had turned half the territory into men hunting a woman who had done nothing but try to save what was left of her brother's good name. "I need to keep this," Effie said. "I will give you a receipt for it, and I swear to you I will see it put right, the land and the debt both, if there is any justice left to be found in this territory." Agnes Prout looked at her a long moment, fever-bright eyes steady despite the illness working through her. "You're a braver woman than I was, Miss Garrison," she said. "I signed because I was afraid and alone. You're riding through a winter with a bounty on your head because you refuse to be afraid enough to quit." "I am plenty afraid," Effie said honestly. "I have simply run out of anything except the nerve to keep going anyway." She left the Prout homestead near dusk, the forged receipt folded carefully into the leather folder beneath the false bottom of her third book crate, alongside the sworn statement Ezra Hollies had signed 2 days before. 2 pieces of proof now, real ones, enough perhaps to begin unraveling the lie if only she could find someone with the authority to care. She had not gone 2 miles before she came to the narrow crossing where the creek pinched tight between its banks, and where the ice, gray and groaning under a skin of blown snow, looked thick enough to bear a wagon's weight if a person did not look too closely at the dark seams running through it. It was not thick enough. The front wheels had nearly cleared the far bank when the ice gave way beneath the horse's hindquarters with a crack like a rifle shot, and the animal screamed and lunged forward in a panic that dragged the wagon's rear wheels down through the broken ice into black water that closed around them instantly, shockingly cold, cold enough to stop a heart. Effie was thrown forward against the brake handle hard enough to knock the breath from her, and for one long, terrible moment she thought the whole wagon would go under, crates and letters and books and all, with her still on the seat. She heard herself shouting the horse's name, heard her own voice come out high and thin and frightened in a way she had not let it be frightened in front of Raymond Ramsey 3 days before. And it was in that moment, with the horse thrashing and the wagon tilting and the water rising black and silent around the broken wheels, that she heard hoofbeats coming hard along the bank, and a voice she recognized shouting for her to hold on, he was coming. Raymond Ramsey came off his horse before the animal had even fully stopped, wading into water that must have been agony against his legs, and got a hand on the horse's bridle to steady the panicked animal while he shouted at Effie to climb back, away from the front, away from the deepest water, and to trust the wagon bed to hold a moment longer. It held. Between the two of them, Raymond hauling on the horse's harness while Effie worked the traces loose with fingers gone numb and clumsy, they got the animal free of the broken ice and up onto solid ground, trembling and blowing hard. And then Raymond turned his attention to the wagon itself, and to the woman still perched on its tilting seat with her skirts already soaked through to the knee where the water had splashed up over the sideboard. "Give me your hands," he said, and there was no gentleness in his voice, only urgency, the flat-clipped tone of a man who had seen what cold water could do to a person and did not intend to watch it happen twice in his life. She gave him her hands, and he pulled her clear of the sinking wagon and up onto the bank, and then, because her skirts were soaked and the wind was already working at the wet cloth to freeze it stiff, he did not hesitate before pulling her up onto his own horse in front of him and turning the animal's head toward his cabin at a pace just short of reckless. "The wagon," Effie said through chattering teeth. "The books, the letters, everything is in there." "The wagon will keep," Raymond said, his arm tight around her to hold her steady against the cold that had already begun to shake through her in long, uncontrollable waves. "You will not, if we don't get you warm inside the hour." He did not take her to the line shack that night. Whatever rule he had made for himself about keeping his distance, about propriety and caution, and the careful line he had drawn between his life and hers, it did not survive the sight of her lips gone faintly blue at the edges, and he brought her instead into his own cabin, sat her close by the stove he built up roaring within minutes, and busied himself finding dry blankets and heating water for tea with the brisk efficiency of a man grateful to have something to do with his hands. "You should not have ridden that crossing," he said, not looking at her, focused instead on the kettle. "That ice has been thin there for a week. I should have warned you. You could not have known I would be foolish enough to try it in failing light," Effie said. Her teeth had finally stopped chattering, and warmth was creeping back into her fingers in painful prickling waves that she welcomed anyway, because the alternative to pain was a numbness she had felt turning dangerous. "Thank you. Again. I seem to be forever thanking you, Mr. Ramsey, and forever telling you not to thank me back." Something that might almost have been a smile crossed his face then, quick and rare. "Raymond," he said, "if I am going to keep pulling you out of frozen creeks, I expect we can dispense with the Mr. Effie then," she said, and found that saying it to him felt like handing over something small and true. It was there, in the warm, close dark of his cabin with the storm beginning to press its shoulder against the walls outside, that she finally told him about the papers hidden beneath the false bottom of her book crate, about Ezra Hollies' statement and Agnes Pruitt's forged receipt, about the notary signature that was not her brother's hand no matter how carefully it had been copied to look like it. Raymond listened with his jaw tight, and when she finished he was quiet a long moment, staring into the stove's small window of firelight. "I heard something in town," he said finally. "Cole and another man talking at Petra Yancey's place. They mean to move your brother out of a line shack up past Crazy Woman Creek this coming Thursday down to the county seat, to a judge that's friendly to the company. I did not like the way they spoke of it, Effie. It did not sound like a man being taken in for trial. It sounded like a man being taken somewhere to be finished." The warmth the stove had built back into her chest went suddenly cold again, though not from any draft. "Then we have 3 days," she said, "to find him first, and to get what proof we have in front of someone who cannot be bought." Raymond said, and there was something in the word, tested aloud like a man checking the weight of a tool he had not picked up in a long while, seeing if his hand still remembered the shape of it. "You mean to go up past Crazy Woman Creek in this weather?" "I mean to go wherever my brother is," Effie said, "whether the weather agrees with the plan or not." "Then I suppose," Raymond said slowly, "that I have run out of reasons to keep my distance." They set out the next morning with the sky a hard flat gray that promised more cold rather than snow, Raymond's horse pulling a sled loaded with what supplies they could gather in haste, the wagon left behind for retrieval later once the creek finished freezing solid enough to bear its weight properly. Effie rode behind him, her arms around his waist against the cold, and if either of them noticed how naturally that closeness had come to feel in the space of a single week, neither of them said so aloud. The trail up past Crazy Woman Creek climbed steadily through stands of lodgepole pine gone black and stark against the snow, and twice they had to stop to walk the horse through drifts too deep to ride through safely, the cold biting at any bare skin left exposed for more than a few minutes. It was hard, punishing travel, and Effie found herself grateful more than once for Raymond's steadiness, his knowledge of the land, his careful reading of the sky that let them find shelter in a hollow of rock, an hour before a squall of ice pellets came screaming down off the peaks above them. They huddled together in that hollow with a small fire built up against the rock face to throw its heat back at them, and it was there, waiting out the worst of the wind, that Raymond told her about Sarah. "She died 2 winters back," he said, not looking at Effie but at the fire, his voice carefully level in the way of a man who has told himself a story so many times he has worn all the rawness out of the telling, or believes he has. "Fever, same as nearly took Widow Prout from what you've told me. I could not get a doctor out here fast enough. I have told myself since that if I never let myself need anyone again, I could never again fail them the way I felt I failed her." "That is not peace," Effie said quietly. "That is only a different kind of drowning. I have watched my father do the same thing after my mother died, and it did not save him from grief. It only meant he grieved alone." Raymond looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her aware suddenly of how close they sat, of the firelight moving warm across his face. "You have a way of saying true things I would rather not hear," he said. "I have been told that before," Effie said. "Usually right before someone stops speaking to me." "I don't intend to stop," Raymond said, and something in the plainness of it, the quiet certainty, made her breath catch in a way that had nothing at all to do with the cold. They reached the line shack past Crazy Woman Creek an hour before dusk on the second day, and found it not empty as Effie had feared, nor guarded as Raymond had worried, but occupied by a gaunt, feverish man with a bandaged shoulder and 3 days' growth of beard who came up off the narrow cot with a revolver shaking in his hand, before he recognized his own sister's voice calling his name through the door. Daniel Garrison had been shot in the shoulder the week before, grazed rather than struck true, but infection had set into the wound despite his rough attempts to clean it, and he was weak enough that Effie had to help him sit back down on the cot before he fainted where he stood. He wept when he embraced her, an ugly, relieved, exhausted sound, and it was some minutes before he could speak clearly enough to tell them what had happened. "Cole and 2 others came on me outside the syndicate office the night I meant to send the ledger to Cheyenne," he said, his voice thin with fever. Whitcomb was there, the surveyor. He'd found out what I was doing and threatened to tell Cole himself unless I cut him in on it, and when I refused, Cole shot him where he stood and told me I would hang for it unless I handed over everything I'd found. I ran instead. I have been running since, and Whitcomb's blood is on Cole's hands, not mine, though the whole territory believes different. We know, Effie said. We have proof, Daniel. Enough to begin unraveling it, if we can get it in front of someone honest. She showed him the folder from beneath the false bottom of her book crate, which she had thankfully transferred to the sled before the wagon went into the creek, and Daniel added to it the ledger itself, smudged and water-stained but still legible, along with a letter he had kept hidden in the shack's woodpile. A letter from an investor in New York instructing the syndicate's local manager to clear the valley of homestead claims, by whatever means proved necessary, before the railroad survey confirmed the route in spring. It was, taken together, damning. It was also, Raymond pointed out grimly, still sitting in a lined shack in the mountains rather than in front of a judge, and Thursday was now only a day away. There is a federal land inspector, Daniel said, Colton Wade. He has been touring the territory investigating claims disputes, and last I heard he was expected at Fort McKinney before Christmas to review complaints out of this district. If we could reach him there, present the evidence directly rather than through the county court, Sorrel and Cole would have no way to bury it. Fort McKinney is a full day's hard ride from here, Raymond said. More in this weather, and you can barely sit a horse. Then I will ride, Effie said, and you will stay with Daniel and get that shoulder properly cleaned, because a fever this deep will kill him faster than any bounty hunter if it isn't tended. I don't like the idea of you riding to Fort McKinney alone, Raymond said, and there was something rough in his voice that told her plainly this was not simple caution, but something closer to fear. The particular fear of a man who has already buried one person he loved and does not intend to stand by silent while it happens again. I have ridden further alone in worse weather this past week, Effie said, gentler now, understanding what lay beneath his objection. And someone must stay with Daniel, and someone must reach the inspector before Sorrel moves him tomorrow. There is no way to do both without splitting up, Raymond. You know that as well as I do. He did know it, and it was that knowledge, more than any argument she made, that finally had him nodding, jaw tight, and pulling her into an embrace that was rough and brief, and said more than either of them had yet found words for. Come back to me, he said against her hair, quiet enough that she almost missed it beneath the wind outside. I intend to, she said. I have every intention of coming back to you, Raymond Ramsey, once this is finished. She left before first light the next morning, the leather folder of evidence wrapped in oilcloth and strapped tight against her body beneath her coat, and rode north through a cold so absolute that the air itself seemed to crack and shimmer at the edges of her vision, her breath freezing to white frost on her scarf within the first hour. She had never ridden so far, so fast, in weather so unforgiving, and she understood with each frozen mile exactly how thin the margin was between the nerve that had carried her this far and the exhaustion that threatened, more than once, to pull her from the saddle entirely. She reached Fort McKinney a little past noon, half frozen, her hands so stiff around the reins that a young sentry had to help her down from the horse, and it took precious minutes of confused explanation before she was finally brought before a weathered, gray-mustached man in a well-cut coat who introduced himself as Inspector Colton Wade, and who listened to her story with an expression that shifted over the course of her telling, from polite skepticism to something considerably sharper. You understand, he said, when she had laid the ledger and the letter and the sworn statements out on the table before him, that if this is genuine, it implicates men with a great deal of money behind them, and money of that kind does not go quietly. I understand, Effie said, that my brother is set to be moved today by a deputy in that same company's pocket, toward a judge who will not ask a single honest question before signing whatever paper is put in front of him. If we do not move faster than they do, Inspector, None of this will matter, because there will be no one left alive to testify to any of it." Wade studied her a long moment, and then he rose from his chair with the brisk decisiveness of a man who had made up his mind. "There's a deputy United States Marshal here at the post on unrelated business, Franklin Voss, a good man, not beholden to any county sheriff or company payroll. If what you say is true, then a county deputy transporting a federal murder suspect out of jurisdiction without proper authority is itself a crime, and Marshal Voss has every right to intervene. Where do you believe they mean to move him?" "Sorrel does not yet know we have found Daniel," Effie said, thinking fast. "He was planning to move him from the line shack up past Crazy Woman Creek. If we can reach that crossing before they do, or catch them on the road, we can stop it before it starts." "Then we had best ride hard," Wade said, "because the light is already going, and I do not fancy explaining to a federal judge why we let a man hang on a lie because we stopped to warm our hands." They rode out within the hour, Effie, Inspector Wade, Marshal Voss, and 4 soldiers Wade requisitioned from the post commander on the strength of his federal authority, pushing their horses hard through the bitter cold back toward the valley, racing a clock none of them could see but all of them could feel, ticking down toward whatever waited at Crazy Woman Creek. They did not reach the line shack in time. What they found instead, cresting the last ridge above the frozen creek crossing as the light began to fail, was a grim tableau already in motion. Ike Sorrel and 2 other riders, with Daniel Garrison bound and slumped weakly between 2 of them on a led horse, and Raymond Ramsey standing alone at the narrow crossing with his rifle raised, having apparently ridden out from the shack to intercept them the moment he realized Sorrel had arrived a full day early. "Ramsey!" Sorrel was shouting as Effie and the others came within earshot, their horses' hooves muffled by the snow. "This is a lawful prisoner transport. Stand aside or you'll be charged with obstruction." "There's nothing lawful about it," Raymond called back, his voice carrying flat and hard across the frozen creek. "I know what you mean to do the moment you're out of sight of witnesses, Sorrel. I've heard Cole talk about it plain enough." It was Vance Cole himself who answered that, stepping his horse forward from where he'd been hanging back near the rear of the group, his own revolver already drawn. "You've heard nothing you can prove, Homesteader. Step aside or you'll join him." Effie's heart seized at the sight of that revolver leveled at Raymond, and she kicked her exhausted horse forward without waiting for the soldiers to catch up, calling out across the crossing, in a voice that cracked with cold and fear and fury all at once. "Marshal Voss is right behind me, Cole, and Inspector Wade of the Federal Land Office, and they have in their hands the very ledger you murdered Whitcomb trying to bury. Shoot Raymond Ramsey and you will hang for 2 murders instead of 1. The soldiers crested the ridge in that same moment, their presence unmistakable even in the failing light, 4 uniformed riders with rifles already unslung, and Effie watched Ike Sorrel's face go through a swift and total collapse of nerve as he understood, all at once, exactly how badly his timing had failed him. "Lower your weapon," Marshal Voss called out, his voice carrying the particular flat authority of a man who had said such words many times before and expected to be obeyed. "Deputy Sorrel, you are transporting a federal murder suspect outside your jurisdiction without proper writ, and I am placing you under arrest pending investigation. Mr. Cole, drop that revolver, or I will consider it an admission of the crime this young woman has just accused you of." For one terrible, suspended moment, nothing moved. Cole's revolver stayed leveled at Raymond, Raymond's rifle stayed leveled at Cole, and the wind howled thin and knife-edged between them across the ice. Then Cole, perhaps calculating the odds of 4 soldiers and a federal marshal against his own 2 remaining men, or perhaps simply losing his nerve the way men who bully the powerless often do the moment real power finally arrives to answer for it, wheeled his horse suddenly and drove his heels hard into its flanks, trying to bolt across the frozen creek toward the far bank and whatever escape the mountains beyond might offer. The ice, already weakened from the same thaw and freeze that had claimed Effie's wagon days before, held for 3 strides and then did not hold at all. Cole's horse went through with a scream and a crack like the whole valley splitting open, and Cole himself was thrown clear onto solid ice a few feet from the break, where he lay stunned and gasping, while 2 of the soldiers waded in without hesitation to pull the terrified, thrashing horse free of the current before it could be swept under. It was, in the end, an almost anticlimactic end to a chase that had cost so much fear and cold and blood. Cole was hauled up, soaked and shaking and entirely without further fight in him, and placed in irons alongside Ike Sorrell, whose surviving companion had thrown down his own rifle the moment the soldiers appeared and had not touched a weapon since. Raymond crossed to Effie before the soldiers had even finished securing the prisoners, and there was no careful distance left in him at all now, none of the wariness of that first evening with the rifle between them. He pulled her from her horse and into his arms with a fierceness that told her, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how frightened he had been in the hour she was gone, and exactly how much had shifted in him since. "You came back," he said against her hair. "I told you I would," she said, and found she was laughing and crying both at once, the release of days of fear breaking loose altogether. "I told you, Raymond, I had every intention." Daniel Garrison, cut loose from his bonds and wrapped immediately in a soldier's spare coat, was too weak and too feverish to do much beyond embrace his sister once more and murmur his thanks to Raymond. But Inspector Wade, examining the ledger and the letters by the light of a soldier's lantern there at the frozen crossing, was already speaking in the brisk, certain tones of a man building a case that would not be easily undone. "This letter alone," he said, tapping the New York investor's instructions, "implicates the syndicate's officers in a conspiracy to defraud homestead claimants under federal statute, and the ledger corroborates every forged relinquishment across this valley. Add to that a murdered surveyor and a fraudulent warrant used to cover the crime, and I do not believe there is a judge in this territory, friendly to the company or not, who will be able to make this quietly disappear." He was right. It took the better part of 2 weeks, through the deepest cold of that hard winter, for the full truth to work its way through the territorial courts, but work its way through it did. Ike Sorrell, eager to save his own neck, testified in full against Vance Cole and the syndicate's local manager, confirming every detail of the forged notary signatures, the manufactured debts, and the murder of the surveyor Whitcomb, committed by Cole's own hand to silence a man who had grown greedy for a larger cut of a scheme he'd only half understood. The wanted notice for Daniel and Effie Garrison was formally rescinded by order of the Territorial Marshal's office, printed in the Cheyenne papers with an admission, however grudging, that the original charges had been based on falsified evidence supplied by parties now themselves under indictment. The Hollies family's testimony and Agnes Pruitt's forged receipt entered alongside a dozen similar statements that came forward once the valley's homesteaders understood they finally had somewhere honest to bring their grievances, formed the backbone of a federal case that saw the Continental Land and Cattle Syndicate's local operations dissolved entirely by the following spring, its remaining claims returned to the families who had been cheated out of them, with restitution ordered from what remained of the company's local assets. Agnes Pruitt got her land back outright, along with a small settlement that let her hire a hand for the heavy work her illness no longer let her manage alone. The Hollies family's claim, never taken in the first place, was cleared of the fraudulent lien entirely. And Daniel Garrison, once his shoulder healed and his name was fully cleared, was offered a position by Inspector Wade himself, helping the Federal Land Office investigate similar frauds across the territory, work he accepted gladly, glad to turn his careful bookkeeper's eye toward catching liars rather than being accused of being one. There was, in the settlement that followed, a reward. $200, offered jointly by the territorial government and by a grateful consortium of the valley's homesteaders, in recognition of the courage it had taken to expose the fraud and bring the guilty to justice. It was offered to Raymond Ramsey and Effie Garrison both, in equal shares, and it was Effie who spoke first when the offer was made, sitting in Petra Yancey's trading post with half the valley crowded in to hear the matter settled. "I did not do this for money," she said. "I did it because my brother was innocent, and because good people were being robbed by lies dressed up as law. I would rather see that money put towards something the whole valley can use." "As would I," Raymond said, and there was no hesitation in him at all now, none of the careful distance of a man protecting himself from ever wanting anything again. "This valley needs a proper bridge at the Crazy Woman crossing, so no one else's wagon goes through that ice the way Effie's did. And it could use a proper library building in Larkspur Crossing, so families do not have to wait on one woman's wagon making its rounds to get their books and their news, especially now that Daniel is off doing federal work and cannot help her drive the circuit." The valley agreed, warmly and without much debate, and by the time the worst of that hard winter finally broke into a slow, muddy spring, a new timber bridge spanned the narrows at Crazy Woman Creek, sturdy enough to bear the heaviest wagon without complaint, and the foundation had been laid in Larkspur Crossing for a small but proper library building, to be stocked in part from Effie's own collection, and in part from a shipment the Territorial Library Association agreed to send once word of the valley's ordeal, and its resolution, reached them. It was on a clear, cold evening in late February, with the worst of the winter behind them but a fine crust of snow still lying over the valley like a blessing, that Raymond Ramsey asked Effie Garrison to marry him, not with any great ceremony, but simply, standing beside her in the doorway of his cabin as the last light went gold, and then violet over the bighorns. "I built myself a solitude I called peace," he said, "because I was afraid of exactly this, of wanting someone enough that losing them again could hollow me out entirely. But I have learned these past months that peace built on nothing is no peace at all, Effie. It is only waiting. I would rather have what we have found together, even knowing it means I could lose it, than go back to that kind of waiting. I have spent my whole adult life keeping moving," Effie said, "carrying other people's letters and other people's news, because it was easier than staying anywhere long enough to be known myself. But this valley is the first place that has ever felt like it was asking me to stay, and you are the first person who has ever made staying sound like more of an adventure than leaving." "Is that a yes?" Raymond asked, and there was a rare, unguarded hope in his voice that undid her entirely. "That is a yes," Effie said, and when he kissed her there in the doorway with the cold, clean air around them and the first stars coming out sharp and bright over the mountains, it was nothing at all like the wary standoff of their first meeting, and everything like the culmination of every careful, quiet act of trust that had grown between them since. That night, with the fire banked low and the wind outside gentled to a soft murmur rather than a howl, Effie stayed at Raymond's cabin not out of necessity, not out of any emergency of ice or cold, but because they had both, freely and openly, chosen it. There was no wariness left between them now, no careful distance kept for propriety's sake or fears, only the slow, unhurried tenderness of two people who had earned each other's trust through frozen creeks and forged papers, and 100 small kindnesses left without asking for thanks. When Raymond touched her face, tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that seemed almost disbelieving of its own good fortune, Effie thought of how far a person could travel, in body and in heart both, between a rifle raised in suspicion and a hand raised instead in tenderness, and she understood that every hard mile of that journey had been worth it to arrive here, in this warm, fire-lit room, in the arms of a man who had first shown his love not in words, but in sacks of coffee and salt pork left quietly at a stranger's door. They married in April, in the yard of the new library building in Larkspur Crossing, with the whole valley in attendance, Ezra and Mary Hollies, Agnes Prout looking stronger than Effie had seen her since that first fevered night. Daniel Garrison home from his federal traveling to stand up for his sister with his shoulder fully healed and his good name fully restored. And Petra Yancey providing more cake and coffee than the whole gathering could rightly finish. Effie wore a dress of pale blue wool, practical enough for the spring chill but fine enough for the occasion, and Raymond wore a coat that had belonged, she knew without needing to be told, to happier days before Sarah's death, taken out and worn again not to erase her memory, but to honor the fact that love, once truly given, does not diminish a heart's capacity to love again. It only teaches that heart what it is worth protecting. They did not build a decades-long dynasty that spring, nor did they need to, for their happiness required no such grand unfolding to be complete. Effie continued her library circuit through the valley, though now with a proper building as her base, and a husband who rode out with her often enough that the two of them became a familiar and welcome sight along the roads of Antelope Creek, delivering books and letters and news to families who no longer had to fear a company's lies hanging over their claims. Raymond kept his ranch, expanded now with land reclaimed for homesteaders who chose to sell rather than resume the hard work of a claim they'd nearly lost, and he found, to his own quiet surprise, that a house with someone in it to come home to felt nothing at all like the vulnerability he had once feared, and everything like the peace he had been chasing all along without ever quite finding it alone. The bridge at Crazy Woman Creek stood solid through every winter that followed, and travelers crossing it sometimes noticed, carved into one of the support beams by a hand that clearly took its time and care over the work, 2 sets of initials and a date, a small private marker of the night. A rifle had first been raised between 2 strangers, and the long hard road that had led, in the end, not to tragedy, but to the beginning of everything good that came after. Effie Garrison, who had come into that valley with nothing left but her nerve, found there at last everything else she had been missing, and Raymond Ramsey, who had mistaken solitude for peace, learned finally the difference between the two, and never again confused them for the rest of his days.